We're back again, everybody. Philosophy for the people. Pat here with Mike. We're going to talk about what the point of philosophy is, if any, and give you guys some updates. There's been a few things cooking over at the Journal of Absolute Truth, the humbly named Journal of Absolute Truth. But yeah, dude, good to see you. What's up?
Yeah. Let's get into it. So so what did we want to start? We want to start with some updates, maybe some housekeeping, maybe some people would be interested in some of the articles that you've been putting out that we've had some good guest contributions lately as well. So and then that can sort of jump into, because I mean some of the topics of these articles might fit well with our conversation on what the point of philosophy is too. So maybe it'll just kind of they'll kind of weave in and out.
Yeah, especially Adler. So yeah, let's do that. There's a few new things out.
You just had one like right before we recorded, because I had it in my upcoming articles and then I had to change it to recently released. Because
sorry, I just like trolling the editor. Right, here's your schedule. Let me go mess it up.
That's all right.
Well, part of here's like a little insight to my head for people who want to know. I can sit with something and tweak it and try and refine it to death. You know what I mean? I think a lot of us have these sort of perfectionist tendencies. So I often just force myself not to have something in the queue, but just to hit publish, just so I stop messing, just so I get something out there. And
that's the best way,
because it's just it's just a blog, right? I'm not writing an academic article, for I want it to be good, of course, and I want it to be thoughtful. But originally, Jat started as just kind of like a sketch pad, and then it kind of developed from there. But like I hate when I get trapped in this cycle of just like looking at the same thing over and over and like overanalyzing it when it's really just a blog post, right? So
yeah.
But anyways, that post, if we want to talk about it, was
let's start with that one.
Yeah, it was on classical theism in the fine tuning argument. And at the beginning, I mentioned when I was writing my book, The Best Argument for God, I wasn't going to put the fine tuning argument in there for a couple of reasons. One is it's just I was kind of taking a somewhat more traditional look at considerations for God. Obviously, the fine-tuning argument was not like something that Aristotle thought about. I mean, they obviously thought about teleology and order and stability, but fine-tuning.
And I mean, your big thing is divine simplicity, and I don't think that on the surface, and you do talk about this. I was kind of scanning through the blog post because you had like I said, you had just posted it, and so I wanted to familiarize myself. But on the surface, they don't seem to go together. And so I think with the best argument for God, it was very contingency and necessity, divine simplicity. Is that, I don't know. I mean, am I misunderstanding? Or
so the best argument for God is it's a cumulative case, right? Yeah. And I kind of try to blend both the traditional and contemporary methodology. So while I think that there are just some sort of good, direct traditional arguments for God, I also do want to say that God is a great theory, right? Classical theism is a great theory. It helps make sense of a lot of things that need to be made sense of in a very elegant and unified way. So fine-tuning is one of the things that I eventually decided to incorporate. I spent a fair amount of time trying to I always had my eye on the literature, but I was like, let me really try and make up my mind on this. And I came out in a very positive side, even if I don't think it's the single most forceful argument for the existence of God. Some people do. I mean, some people really, and even people who were skeptics or are skeptics will say this argument is this is the one that bothers me the most or something like that, right? And so I put it in the book. I defended it. I pressed, looked at what I think are the best objections to it, and then what I didn't mention explicitly in the book, although it's obvious, I think, if you kind of know where I'm coming from, is how classical theism just kind of directly addresses a number of objections that are brought against the fine-tuning argument. And by classical theism, I mean not just commitments to the divine simplicity and the particular philosophy of God, but the general metaphysical program from which classical theism emerges. So I cover a few of those in that article, and I say, hey, here's an objection to fine-tuning. Maybe there's a good answer out there from non-classical theists or people who are operating with a sort of non-classical metaphysic, but here's something cool. The classical metaphysic like directly addresses this objection. For example, objections like, why would God want to create beings like us? What makes you think that we're good? Well, there's a whole metaphysic of goodness and a chain of being and the principle of diffusiveness and plenitude that speak directly to that from that paradigm. And these are principles that are independently motivated. So it's just it's sort of a neat result that it directly relates to that particular. Sometimes this is called like the divine psychology objection, right? Like his God psychology is inscrutable. So why assume that he would want to make beings like us at all? But what I'm saying is that there's a metaphysical paradigm here that makes our existence highly likely.
Well, and I've heard you talk about this other places too, where you make this distinction between, there's the apologetic case or like the defense of that, divine simplicity and classical theism can sort of make. But then on the opposite side, like you want to also make a positive case. You want to present this and say it's not just that we can defend this and that it makes sense, but that it also presents positively the best view of reality, whether that's human nature or God's nature or just reality in general.
Yeah, I mean, like certainly. I mean, you can sort of defend a lot of views with respect to just avoiding like radical incoherence, contradictions, and stuff like that. But I don't think that's worth all that much. Like we want to make sure your theory actually does it's a good theory that it satisfies certain theoretical virtues like explanatory comprehensiveness.
Well, it's kind of like as a, I guess, sort of analogy or whatever. You see this happen a lot where when somebody gets really into apologetics, when it comes to like Christian apologetics or specifically Catholic apologetics, and how they get really, really interested in like defending against these sort of objections. And it's and it can be really interesting, it can be really attractive, but you don't want your entire, in this case, Christian faith or Catholic faith to be reactionary. And you don't want your faith in classical theism or your understanding of God to be purely reactionary. You want it to be, but here's how it kind of stands on its own. And so that's where the whole making a positive case, or what can Christian theology positively present in terms of its understanding of God or reality.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly right. Even with respect to classical theism, I feel like there's been a lot of defense going on in recent years. I mean, addressing objections of modal collapse and the coherence of simplicity and all that sort of stuff, right? And I've got an article on that actually, and it was published in Theologica not too long ago. So specifically on modal collapse contingent knowledge issues. So I'm engaged in that. I think it is important. I think it is important to do that defensive work and show that you're not committed to, absurdities or serious consequences that are very expensive or stuff like that. But I mean, yeah, absolutely. You need to be making the positive case. And I mean, historically, traditionally, the reason classical theism was so dominant is it just seemed like this is, and we've talked about this before a ton of times. Like this is what can sort of ground everything that ultimately needs to be grounded without itself requiring any further ground. So it was precisely because of its sort of power within a descriptive and explanatory metaphysical program that it was adopted. It wasn't just because people thought it could be defended as coherent. They thought it did real metaphysical work. Right.
It became baseline for a reason. Like, even though we're maybe coming at it from the circumstances of, well, now it's becoming challenged so much for various reasons. It was the baseline for, basically going
dominant.
back.
Yeah. Dominant.
So it's like that didn't just pop up out of nowhere either. And so, you'd have to at least wonder, like, well, what influenced the original, philosophers who are making this case? Like, why did it become the dominant thing in the first place?
Yeah. But back to the and the answer is just the general philosophy of nature and metaphysic that they were using, which I still think has a lot going for it. But back to the fine tuning stuff. Yeah, there's several objections. I just mentioned one. One is related to the idea that well, look at all this, like, man, like if God were to bring about life, why would it have to be so complicated? Look at all this physical wind up. Like, couldn't he just brought about life in a more simple manner, in a less complicated way? et cetera, maybe without having any sort of physical universe at all. So in fact, the way that life emerged, given all that, seems less likely if God exists than if God were to bring about life directly. I never found this objection particularly forceful or interesting, but it's something, again, that I think classical theism can respond to very strongly. I mean, first, there's the pithy objection, is that, yeah, God did bring about life without the pithy response, without a physical universe. And they're called angels, right? They're there.
Yeah.
But beyond that, a classical theists are real essentialists. So they think that things have what are called hidden de re necessities, like baked in constraints that really flow from the essences of things, right? Like gold is atomic number 79. Water is H2O. Stuff that isn't obvious from casual observation or even all the time from scientific investigation, but are real essential constraints. And the point there is that just because you might think you might be able to imagine or conceive of life coming about in some other manner with some sort of different physical setup or no physical setup at all, it doesn't mean that's actually metaphysically possible. It might very well be the case, I think it actually is the case, that if you want beings like us, not angels, but us specifically, then you very much need the sort of system in which we are embedded, right? And that's a fact that not even omnipotence can get around. So if you're a real essentialist and you hold to these sort of a posteriori necessities, these hidden de re necessities, again, you have a sort of a wider picture that helps to address these sorts of concerns almost head on. And it's always nice. I think it's always nice when like you already have these tools in your toolkit and they're just ready to immediately respond to objections, right? Rather than you're faced with the objection and now you have to like invent or bring in something new that's ad hoc or contrived, right? These are principles that the classical theist already has that directly relate to certain challenges to the fine-tuning argument. So I'm just highlighting some of those advantages.
Sure. Well, and actually, it kind of ties in. So you talking about like the fine tuning argument sort of ties into another recently released. So I also posted a review to, and you've interviewed Dr. Michael Rhoda talking about his book, Taking Pascal's Wager. And in the middle section of that book, he covers questions related to the fine tuning argument, covering a lot of those considerations, kind of like you do in your article and then in your book, Best Argument for God too. And so I don't talk about the fine tuning part as much in my review. I spend more time talking about the contingency and necessity that he spends a good portion on, like I said, in the middle portion after he covers Pascal's Wager, which I think one of the most important things that he does in that book, and that book came out, I guess it's going on 8 years ago now, or 9 years ago now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know it. Time goes fast, doesn't it? But
It's wild.
But the most important contribution is, and I talk about this in my review, is Pascal's Wager, part of its popularity is due to its simplicity, but then that's kind of a double-edged sword because with its simplicity comes a lot of room for almost like people can sort of like put their own interpretations on it or put their own sort of spins to it, whether it's for or against. And so, and I remember seeing this a lot, especially when I was much younger and in my undergraduate, where I was first sort of looking for resources when it comes to philosophy, arguments for God, things like that. And again, you see Pascal's Wager come up because everybody has an opinion on it, or everybody, it's because it's so simple, because it's so pithy, students will remember it. And so people talk about it or use it. But unfortunately, like I said, that leads to a lot of misunderstanding or misinterpretation or misapplication of Pascal's Wager. And so I think what Dr. Rhoda does is he gives a more robust, philosophical treatment to it to kind of make some of these important distinctions, and then also builds the case for, and here's why it's not just a sort of like, it sort of gets thrown out as like this arbitrary, well, you better choose because, something bad's going to happen to you, right? It's kind of the sword of Damocles is kind of how it's presented. And he's saying, well, that's not what Pascal was originally doing. And that's actually not the intention of it, right? It's saying, here's all of the, the steps that should lead you to that decision. It's not like the decision just shows up in a vacuum.
Yeah, that's good. It's been a while since I've read his book, but I remember really liking it. I've recommended it lots of times. And yeah, so what he does, if I remember right, you correct me because you've read it more recently than I have, is he does make a case for Christianity, and you're right. He does like a sort of contingency argument, a very modest one. He thinks here's good reasons to think there has to be a necessary being. And then he sort of blends that with fine tuning, and he thinks that well, fine tuning is a good reason to think that whatever this necessary being is something endowed with intelligence, right? So that gets you like close to the idea of God. He doesn't like build out a fully robust classical theistic, right?
No. And then he kind of goes into,
but then he looks at evidence for Christianity too, right?
So yeah, he talks about the resurrection towards the end of part 2. Yeah,
and the reason he does this is he thinks that the wager really only kicks in at a certain point, right? He thinks it kicks in when you're like kind of when your options are narrowed and of certain proportion to one another. Like you're 50-50 on either Christianity or atheism, right? Yeah. So you've kind of whittled things down, you've used your reason, and you're like, okay, this is kind of where I'm at. I'm between these two things. So like by narrowing it down, he sort of skirts a number of objections, like, and he talks about them, the other religions' objections and stuff like that too. He does address those head on. And then he thinks this isn't a matter of like, flipping the switch on belief. You just believe Christianity. He thinks that it then becomes very rational if you're in that sort of position to at least engage a life of religious seeking, right? To engage a life of religious seeking. And then he gives examples of what that sort of life looks like. So yeah, I like his book a lot. It's been a while since I've thought about the wager, but I remember as somebody who was kind of like, initially a bit skeptical of it myself, but having not thought too much about it because I was never just honestly all that interested in it. I just remember really liking the advances that Rhoda made in that book. Yeah.
And it kind of, it reminds me of a previous conversation we had when we were talking about our quote unquote favorite or least favorite arguments for God, and how one of the points that I made in talking about my least favorite isn't even like that they're inherently flawed or inherently like unpersuasive. It's just how useful would they be in the context that I'm in or when I'm presenting them. And in some ways, Pascal's wager can be very, very useful. Right. Yeah. And then again, that goes back to the simplicity thing. That goes back to the, in some sense, we have this sort of like built into us that we need to make a decision. Right. And we can start getting into the whole like cultural like phenomenon of people growing up and people, maturing and having to kind of think outside of themselves or act outside of themselves. And in some ways, right, that's sort of what Pascal's wager is it's sort of a, you're confronted with like this huge, in a sense, life altering decision, and you not choosing is still making a decision. And so it's like, you're going to have to choose one way or the other anyway. So you might as well. And like you said, it doesn't even have to be applied so much as a God or not. It's more like am I going to actually seek out an answer or not? Yeah. And like I said, I think that's the going back to, Rhoda's treatment of it. That's the bigger contribution, or I think the more lasting contribution that taking Pascal's wager provides. So you can find that on Journal of Absolute Truth too. So.
Yeah, he's also got a more academic and rigorous treatment of the fine-tuning argument, which I enjoyed very much. It's in a volume on natural theology. I forget the name, but if you search his work, it'll pop up. So people should check that out if they're interested in that. This sort of brings up the theme we wanted to explore, is of what use is philosophy.
Yeah,
and when it comes to philosophical arguments in general, the answer, I think, is not very much, right? Insofar as if
nothing and everything.
If you think that you're going to like persuade a bunch of people with philosophy, you are in for a lot of disappointment, my friends. A lot of disappointment. I mean, very, very rarely are people actually like turned by philosophical arguments. I mean, in lots of cases, philosophical arguments are very complex. Most people, especially not professional philosophers, don't even understand them. They don't even care to understand them, right? And certainly, like the arguments that like persuaded me or convinced me the most are just almost entirely apologetically useless, because of everything that sort of goes into them. That's not to say I don't think there are good arguments. A good argument is a valid one with premises which we can, that are rationally decidable through the usual methods of philosophy, whether analytic, phenomenological, existential. I think there are good arguments. I think there are good arguments for God, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be persuasive. It doesn't mean that they're going to be understood. So you have to be able to sort of distinguish these things. On the other hand, sort of to what you're saying, Mike, there are arguments that I think are not good arguments that just do seem to have a lot of pull on people too. There's some real apologetic currency to things I find not very forceful at all from a philosophical perspective. So what I always try to mention to people is that, for me, philosophy is sort of a selfish enterprise. I've always engaged in philosophy because I want to know what is true. I want to try and figure out what ultimate reality is and whether reality is something that is open to our intellects and what sort of methods we can use to answer questions. And that's my curiosity. So philosophy is a tool for getting at truth. It's not necessarily, so it's useful for that. I think if you take it seriously, you have the right attitude. But in terms of, is this going to be what I use to convert and convince the whole world? No. And I'm not saying that, especially, coming from a Christian perspective, that means you don't or shouldn't use philosophy to evangelize it. It has its place. I'm just thinking that when it comes to evangelization and a lot of what goes into persuasion, there are a lot of things that are a lot that make a lot more of an advance, including one's personal character and demeanor, that bear on people in ways that actually tend to influence whether they're even open to hearing the sorts of arguments that you might eventually.
And the thing about that point too is, for one, none of those things can be like separated within a person. So like you fulfilling that desire because, and for one, that's not like an arbitrary desire or a superficial desire to seek out the truth, especially about the deepest things about reality, right? Or ultimately to seek wisdom. That's built into your human nature, right? We would say that as a human with a rational soul, you have an intellect, and that intellect by its nature seeks the truth, and not just the truth about what would Aristotle say? Like not just truth about like the temporal things, but the transcendental things, right? So it's like in one sense, it's fulfilling this desire that goes deeper than whatever the latest fad is or whatever the creature comforts are, and in so doing, right, that pursuit of wisdom will inevitably, like wisdom is it's a virtue, right? And so like, and it's also the virtue that sort of like in a sense ties all the others together, in that it's sort of it's kind of like the connecting thread that brings all the other virtues together. And so it will actually strengthen the cardinal virtues, or the more quote unquote practical virtues, in that person who does it. And so then it does become, again, to use the kind of modern language of useful or practical. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess certainly I think when I say philosophy isn't worth all that much, I mean, in terms of convincing other people, I don't think it's worth all that much. Of course, I think it's worth a whole lot in the sense that if nothing else, it should help you to think in clearer channels, right? It should help you to get your own methodology straight, to be more critically reflective, of course, of not all positions, but even your own position. So I think there's great utility in philosophy for the potential of your own development, not just intellectual, but moral as well, right? So I think so in one sense, it's extremely useful. In another sense, it's hardly useful at all. And people will be like, well, Pat, why do you write and talk so much on all these arguments and stuff? Maybe I just like doing useless things, right? right.
But yeah, I mean, it's
obvious.
Again,
I was thinking about that the other day. Like, who there are certain people, right? And there's a range here. I mean, there's certain people, and they often shriek at me in comments and emails and social media, like that. Like our assumptions are so not shared that there's no way There's no way that pretty much anything I'm going to say philosophically is going to land on these people. I'm happy to have them read my arguments. They can yell at me and tell me how wrong I am as much as they want.
Yeah, they
But
keep
I
reading,
have
right?
I
So
have yeah,
yeah,
they
they
do
keep
keep reading.
engaging.
Yeah.
That
But
helps the algorithm.
I also have no like expectation that these considerations are going to flip them. But then there are, so I guess I'm walking back a little bit of what I said before. Like there are other people that do share more in common with me, right? More common assumptions where because we have more common ground, uh, the likeliness of certain of my presenting certain arguments having force or changing their mind on something um, increases. And then, of course, I'm also talking to a lot of people who do just believe a lot of the same sorts of things that I believe. And so, if nothing else, maybe it's helpful to them in better understanding those commitments and better seeing the coherence of them, and even better presenting them as rational options, if nothing else, to other people as well. But at the end of the day, I do this stuff because I enjoy it. I like thinking through these things.
Mhm.
And the fact that if it is ever beneficial to other people in some way or another, that's all benefit. That's all bonus. But I write about the things I write about on my Substack. I talk about the things I talk about here, even in my academic work. Those topics are chosen not because I'm just trying to fill some niche, but because these are the things that interest me, and they're questions that I'm trying to answer that I think I have a decent answer to, and I want to, there's something in me that feels the need or the drive to do those sorts of things, right?
Well, and we have this moment. I think a lot of us have this moment if we're kind of introspective or self-reflective, where we realize that we're, even though we feel very unique or we feel very individual in terms of our own thoughts or in terms of our own ideas, and then we have that moment of, oh, somebody else has had this idea or somebody else has had this thought or somebody else has had this question. In one sense it can be like, oh, so I'm not as special as I thought I was. But then in another way it can be very you're like, oh, there's somebody else out there like me, right? It can be kind of comforting or whatever. And it's the same thing. People always talk about this when it comes to somebody writes some article or makes some movie or something. They're like, oh, I thought I was the only one who had that thought, or I thought I was the only one who had that question. And
Mm.
it's supposed to be, and it goes back to the thing I said earlier, where it's like, well, this idea of searching for ultimate answers, or the truth about deeper realities, it's built into human nature, right? It's part of the rational soul, or it's part of the intellect. And so in some sense it should tap into everybody, even if it's not as obvious on the surface, or a person is distracted by this or that or the other thing. And but it's still there. It's still, you could say, dormant within the soul, this search for, whether it's truths about our own human nature, or truths about ultimate reality, or the ground of reality, which we would recognize as God, and our view of God in terms of classical theism, divine simplicity, all that stuff. um,
Yeah, I think I think that's generally right, of course, because even people who deeply disagree with me, right, they
mm,
think that the position they hold is the true one, and they think that it's worth it. It's valuable. It's in some sense good to get at the truth of things. We just disagree, so we kind of agree on that. We just disagree about what the truth of things actually is. I want to bring up another point that might seem like an initial inconsistency in what I said, and to some extent it might actually be, is people say, well, Pat, you were a naturalist for a while and philosophy changed your mind. So clearly it can. Well, yeah, it can. But I also want to like highlight certain things about my case. It's funny because, when I first started, like when I converted many years ago now,
mm,
and I started talking about it, one of the comments I got a lot of times was, this guy was never really an atheist. Anybody who's really an atheist would have done that. It's just a stupid comment.
mm,
But to some extent, it's kind of true. Like, yeah, I was a naturalist for a while, but like as I've been very open about, I was always quite dissatisfied with how that explanatory program proceeded.
mm,
And I often talk about how, I sort of threw my hands up at one point before I became a theist and just rejected a lot of it and just sort of went, okay, I don't know what's true, but I'm pretty sure this isn't it. So it wasn't like my will was set on atheism or naturalism. It certainly wasn't. I was never like religiously hostile. I would make some kind of joking remarks here or there. Never had any inherent bias against religious people. Never had any bad experiences with religious people. Frankly, just never really grew up around many of them. And really, and what I was rejecting, and I've talked about this on my Substack, was a certain version of God that I still reject, that I still think isn't true. So what I needed shown to me were theoretical options and conceptions that were never shown to me before. And as soon as I was shown to me a certain paradigm, a certain philosophy of God that actually could answer the types, or seemed like it could answer the types of questions that I felt needed answers, and do so in a principled way, like of course I grabbed onto that. But that's very different than like me being like, I'm a staunch like atheist and somebody just gives me a contingency argument. Oh, mind switched, right? No, like my orientation was such that here is a whole bunch of stuff that I think needs to be accounted for. I'm really dissatisfied with the accounts I've tried so far. I have this cartoon version of God. And then when this, these paradigms are made known to me in a conception of God that I had never really understood or encountered before, that was very different. It just felt like an expansion of options that I did not know was available for. And philosophy is what did that. But that definitely is a different sort of thing than just expecting like you're just going to convince somebody who's already pretty darn well committed to a position by just throwing a single type of argument at them. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah. And I think, it kind of goes back to, it reminded me of a previous conversation that we've had in a previous episode too, but where it's like, for one, philosophy has this negative value and positive value, not negative in the sense of bad, but like negative in that it takes something away. And so often, right, so much of the work that would have to be done when it comes to having, whether it's a religious debate about God, about morality, whatever, is it's sort of like stripping away some of these like these extra kind of things that are sort of like confusing the issue. And I don't even just mean like red herrings. I mean like, well, we might share like similar, and you kind of said this yourself, where it's like, you might even share very similar foundations or very similar first principles with that person who comes to a different conclusion than you. But it's like, there's these other sort of connecting, like these other connecting strands or connecting tissues that is what leads both of you in different directions. And one of the valuable contributions of philosophy is, well, if one person's is more consistent, right, or logically, coherent, then that can be used to sort of strip some of those things away. And then, hey, we can get back down to that foundation or those first principles, and then maybe build something up that, whether it's you or the other person, actually is more coherent, it makes more sense, and then it would maybe bring you to at least a more similar conclusion. And it's not even like the point of it is, so that we can agree and get along. It's obviously both of you, to kind of use the Socratic maxim of like, you're both trying to find the truth ultimately. And whether it's you who needs to correct something, or you that needs to kind of rethink something, or the other person who needs to question an assumption, right? That's sort of what that negative value of philosophy can bring, is it helps kind of ask those questions and strip down to, well, what are those first principles? And this is the other conversation that you and I were having, is brute facts versus first principles. Is it's like, again, it kind of goes back to this human nature thing, where it's like, I think if you dig down deep enough, you will find similar like first principles that humans, that people adhere to, even if they don't recognize them, or even if they would claim the opposite, right? Like you even said, me and this other person, we differ on our conclusion about the existence of God, but we both agree in the first principle of, trying to find the truth, or that we're ordered towards the truth, or that the truth is possible to know.
Or that it's good to get at truth, or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I think.
Yeah. So there again, even when you say like our intellect is ordered towards truth, right? And not that another person would use that language, but if they can recognize that similarity, you've actually just agreed on teleology, which takes you a really like that takes you down the road in terms of coming to a belief in God ultimately too.
Oh, maybe.
Yeah.
Reminds me. Last point is for something else for people to check out on Substack. I shared it on the notes the notes thing. I've been on Substack for a while. I actually don't don't even know the platform that well. The note, whatever, like the little tweet thing is on
It's
Substack.
basically Twitter, but yeah, I know.
Yeah. So Josh had a good post on like the art of conversation, and just a lot of like really good reminders of if you want to actually have productive conversation with people, um, here are some things to keep in mind. And he emphasizes the idea of mutual respect and like how important that is. Like this seems like the most obvious thing in the world, but pretty much everybody on the internet forgets it, right? That like if you're actually friends with people, they're much more likely to entertain your ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you form some common ground, whether that's, I don't know, you both like the same football team, and you form some sort of genuine mutual respect, despite your disagreements, you actually can become friendly with people. That's where you can actually have, I think, a very productive exchange of ideas. And of course, that means doing a little bit more of a relationship building in the long game. But I think it's really important because it works both ways, insofar as like you then will be in a position to hear them out more. You then will be a bit more open-minded to make sure that they are then serving as a tool in your hunt for truth to sharpen your own thought, right? Because it's always easy to look at the other guy and accuse them of bias, but it's important that we always make sure that we're keeping a check on ourselves as well.
Do you know the corny line they say in education, Pat? They say students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Oh,
and
that's
isn't
sweet.
that nice? And it's got the little it turns on itself a little bit. It's kind of nice. So
yeah,
and it works on the
I have
internet
heard
too.
that before.
Yeah.
I have heard that before. Okay, very good. So people can check out that post by Rasmussen. I think it's called, his Substack is Worldview Design. I think it was called The Art of Conversation, and all the other cool stuff we got going on over at the Journal of Absolute Truth. How's that sound?
Do we want to talk about some of the upcoming ones actually too, or like I know we have at least we do have one in the hopper for next week from Carlo Broussard. Do we want to?
Okay,
I can just give a little bit of a preview. Obviously, I won't talk about the whole thing. We want to point people to it, but so it's I am whether I think or not, and so he's obviously kind of referring back to that whole Rene Descartes, I think therefore I am, and the Cartesian dualism that has sort of come about, since Rene Descartes, and he's applying it specifically to when it comes to human nature and personhood, in regards to the moral issue of abortion, and how, because that's a big part of the abortion debate is when does the human become person, quote unquote,
personhood,
right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And so he sort of uses that and kind of ties those together, and like Catholic philosophy rejects the idea of Cartesian dualism, and shows kind of where it falls short. So that's something that it's planned to come out next week. So that's one of the upcoming ones.
Awesome.
And it's sort of, I don't know, it reflects this trend that I'm noticing where a lot of the guest contributions that we're getting have to do with kind of human nature. Like human nature is on a lot of people's minds, and it probably has to do with like the whole rise of artificial intelligence and stuff. But people are asking that question of what makes us human, which in some ways, right, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about of the point of philosophy. It's not just to defend what was the quote unquote traditional view, but it's also going to, I think, help us put forward a positive case in terms of understanding our humanity better, starting with that philosophical. But then obviously, if you move into, from both of our both of our backgrounds, the Catholic theological view too, right, and how they kind of cohere and support each other too.
Yeah, philosophical anthropology, a very important branch of philosophy. So cool. All right, people, head over to Journal of Absolute Truth. We'll be writing more stuff over there. And in the meantime, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Feel free to leave your thoughts, share it around. See you next time.
Show Pat how practical it is, and become a subscriber and all that stuff. So
see you guys.